Wow, okay, so we've got a case here that reads like a legal thriller.
Yeah, this one's a doozy.
We're talking accusations of bias, a mother separated from her kids, and a system that seems to be failing the very people it's supposed to protect.
It sounds like our kind of deep dive.
Exactly. Buckle up, listeners, because we're diving headfirst into a stack of legal documents. Complaints filed against a guardian ad litem and a judge in Johnson County, Kansas.
Think of this as your own personal legal briefing, cutting through the legalese to get to the heart of these allegations.
All right, so let's set the stage. Our listener is dealing with a high-conflict custody case.
High conflict is putting it mildly.
And when I say high conflict, I mean intense. We're talking about a mother, Christina Wheeler, who hasn't seen her children in over 200 days.
And that's where the guardian ad litem comes in Bradley Wagner. Now, for those who aren't familiar with family law, a GAL is appointed by the court to represent the best interests of the children involved.
Right, so kind of like an advocate for the kids, making sure their voices are heard.
Exactly. They investigate the situation, interview everyone involved, and make recommendations to the judge.
So it's a position of huge responsibility, which is why these complaints against Mr. Wagner are so concerning. They really strike at the core of his role. Impartiality, fairness, making sure those children's needs are met above all else.
And that's exactly what the first complaint alleges he's not doing. Lack of communication, potential bias toward the father, failure to facilitate contact with the mother.
Hold on, so he's not communicating with the mother, but he's potentially favoring the father.
That's what the complaint alleges. Ignored calls, unanswered emails, the whole 9 yards.
While he's allegedly in constant contact with the father and his attorney.
You got it. It makes you wonder whose side is he really on.
Right, like is he really there for the kids or is there something else going on? And it gets worse. The complaint claims Mr. Wagner didn't do anything to facilitate contact between Christina and her kids. Not even a phone call. A letter.
The complaint claims nothing. Imagine being completely shut out of your children's lives for months on end.
I can't even imagine. It's heartbreaking. And this is after he's supposed to be making sure the children's needs are being met. This is the person the court appointed to be their advocate.
And it's not just about the lack of contact. There are also claims about misrepresentation regarding a court-appointed evaluator.
So not only is he potentially playing favorites, he's also being accused of being dishonest about it. That's a serious breach of trust.
Absolutely. And then there's the issue of Mr. Wagner's other job. He's also a judge, but in a different jurisdiction. The complaint argues this is a huge conflict of interest.
Because how can he be objective as a GAL in one courtroom if he's making judgments as a judge in another?
That's the question Christina raises. It raises concerns about bias and whether his actions as a GAL are being influenced by his judicial role in the other county.
It's a lot to unpack. And remember, this is all just from the first complaint. We haven't even gotten to the second one yet.
Oh, the second complaint. That's where things get really interesting. This one alleges that Mr. Wagner interfered with a Department of Children and Families investigation, a DCF investigation.
Oh, hold on. A DCF investigation?
Yeah.
How does a guardian ad litem interfere with that?
According to the complaint, Christina was initially told by a DCF social worker that they were going to close her case.
Because they found no signs of harm to the children, right?
Right. But after that social worker spoke to Mr. Wagner, everything changed. Christina's children were removed from her custody.
Wait, so you're saying that a conversation with the GAL changed the entire course of a DCF investigation?
That's what the complaint alleges.
That's a lot of power for one person to have. I mean, I know GALs are supposed to advocate for the children, but they're not supposed to be able to dictate the outcome of an external investigation, right?
Yeah.
Especially one as sensitive as a DCF case.
Exactly.
It makes you wonder what was said in that conversation with the social worker, and more importantly, was it even appropriate for the GAL to be involved at that level?
Those are questions the court will have to answer. But the fact that this is even an allegation speaks volumes about the power dynamics at play in this case.
Absolutely. And as if things couldn't get any messier, we also have a complaint against the judge in this case, Judge David Steele.
2 for the price of 1. This case just keeps getting better.
Right. It's not just the GAL under fire here, it's the entire courtroom.
And the allegations against Judge Steele are very similar to those against Mr. Wagner, potential bias toward the father. For example, Christina claims Judge Steele didn't take her concerns about being stalked and harassed by her ex-husband seriously, even when she brought evidence of restraining order violations.
So she's saying she tried to tell the judge she was being harassed. She even had proof, but he just ignored her.
That's what she's claiming in the complaint. It's sadly a story you hear far too often in family court. Individuals feeling like their voices aren't being heard, especially when it comes to domestic violence and abuse.
That's awful. It makes you question if the system is even capable of protecting the people who need it most. But before we go any further, we should probably break down exactly what Christina is accusing Judge Steele of doing.
Okay, so to start, one of the most serious allegations is that Judge Steele seemed to always favor the father's side of the story, even when there wasn't any evidence to support it.
So she's saying the judge just inherently believed the father over her.
That's what she's claiming. And she says that this happened a lot, not just once or twice. That there's a pattern of the judge siding with the father and not even considering her side of the story or the evidence she presented.
It just sounds so disempowering to feel like you're not being heard, not being believed, especially by the person who is supposed to be impartial, the person who's supposed to make sure everything is fair.
Right. And that feeling of being silenced by the very person who is supposed to be impartial can be incredibly damaging, not just to the case itself, but to your faith in the justice system as a whole.
And just to clarify, Christina didn't have a lawyer during this time, right? She was representing herself.
That's correct. She was representing herself in court.
Which makes this next allegation even more troubling. She claims that Judge Steele refused to let a friend sit with her for support while she was being questioned.
Denied her request outright.
Wow. So she's alone in this high-stakes custody battle representing herself, and she can't even have a friend there for moral support.
That's her allegation. And to make matters worse, Christina claims that Judge Steele allowed the father to have someone he called an IT person sit with him during the proceedings.
An IT person?
Turns out this IT person was actually another lawyer there to help the father.
Wait a minute, are you serious? So Christina, who is representing herself, is denied any support while the father gets to have two lawyers in the room. If that's true, that's a blatant double standard.
That's exactly what Christina alleges. And it really feeds into that larger narrative of bias and unequal treatment that she's presenting in her complaint.
It's a lot to process. A mother fighting for her children, a GAL accused of serious misconduct, and a judge facing allegations of bias. It's like something out of a John Grisham novel.
It really highlights the power that judges, lawyers, and court-appointed officials have in these situations, and how important it is that that power is used responsibly and fairly.
And in the middle of all of this, you have 5 kids who haven't seen their mother in over 200 days.
And that's where we're headed next. What does all of this mean for those children?
We'll dive into that and more when we come back for part 2 of this deep dive. Stay with us.
It's easy to get lost in the legal weeds with a case like this, but we can't forget about the kids.
Right. I mean, at the heart of it all, you have 5 children who haven't seen their mother in over 200 days.
That's not just a number on a page, that's a significant chunk of their lives.
It really makes you think about the human cost of these custody battles.
Absolutely. And the impact it can have on a child's development, their sense of security, their whole world, really.
And then you add in those allegations about the GAL, about Mr. Wagner.
The fact that the children told their mother they were afraid of him.
Yeah, and that he just dismissed their fears, laughed at them even. That's got to leave a mark.
Children in these situations are already feeling incredibly vulnerable. They need to feel heard, validated by the adults in their lives.
Especially by someone like a GAL who's supposed to be their advocate.
Exactly. To have your fears dismissed, or worse, mocked by the person who's supposed to be looking out for you, that can be incredibly damaging.
It's like a betrayal of trust on top of everything else they're going through.
Right. Their family's falling apart. They're caught in the middle of this custody battle. And then the one person who's supposed to be on their side is adding to their stress.
So what kind of lasting impact does something like this have on a child? I mean, we're talking about potentially shaping their entire worldview.
Well, for starters, studies have shown that children who experience parental alienation, neglect, things like that, are at a higher risk for all sorts of issues later in life.
Like what? What kind of issues?
They're more likely to suffer from depression, anxiety, low self-esteem. They may have trouble forming healthy attachments, have difficulty in relationships. Some research even suggests a link between childhood trauma and physical health problems later on.
Wow, so this isn't just about hurt feelings.
Exactly. This is serious stuff.
Right.
And that's why it's so important to advocate for these kids. Make sure their voices are heard. Make sure the adults in their lives are putting their needs first, both now and in the long run.
Absolutely. And speaking of putting their needs first, we haven't even touched on the DCF investigation.
Oh, right. The elephant in the room.
I mean, even if the allegations against Christina were unfounded, and it's important to remember that they are just allegations at this point, but even the act of having your children taken away, of being investigated like that,
It's incredibly traumatic. No matter what the outcome is, imagine being a child. Suddenly you're being interviewed by strangers about your home life, your parents.
it's scary, it's confusing.
Exactly. And even if a parent is ultimately cleared of any wrongdoing, that suspicion, that investigation, it can have a lasting impact.
It's like a stain that never quite goes away.
And that gets to a bigger issue with these kinds of cases, with family court in general. It often feels like the focus is on assigning blame rather than actually trying to understand the family dynamics at play.
And making sure the kids are okay.
Right. That should be the priority, shouldn't it? But it often feels like it gets lost in the shuffle.
So what are the safeguards to make sure children are actually being protected during these legal battles? Because based on these complaints, it doesn't seem like there are any.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And unfortunately, there isn't an easy answer.
So what can we do? As a society, as individuals, what can we do to prevent these kinds of situations from happening? Or at least mitigate the potential harm?
Well, we're going to need some major systemic change, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But it starts with awareness, with shining a light on cases like this.
Because what happens in a Johnson County courtroom could be happening anywhere.
Exactly. And we need to talk about it. We need to demand better for these families.
We'll pick up this conversation and hopefully find some answers when we come back for the final part of this deep dive. Stay tuned. We've covered a lot of ground in this case. Allegations of bias, misconduct, really serious stuff.
And we've only scratched the surface.
But as we wrap things up here, I keep thinking about the bigger picture. What does it all mean? What can we learn from this case?
It's a tough question. But I think this case highlights a really disturbing reality about family court.
It is.
That there's a huge power imbalance. You have judges, lawyers, court-appointed officials. These people have an incredible amount of power.
And they're making life-altering decisions.
Exactly. Decisions that impact entire families. And the people on the receiving end of those decisions often feel powerless.
Especially if they don't have the resources for a good lawyer.
Right. It can feel like an uphill battle from the start. And when you factor in the emotions involved in these cases.
The grief, the anger, it's a pressure cooker.
Exactly. It's a recipe for disaster.
So what can we do? How do we prevent these kinds of situations from happening? Because what happened in Johnson County could happen anywhere, right?
It's a systemic problem, so it's going to take systemic change.
Like what? Give us some answers.
Well, for starters, we need greater transparency in family court, more open hearings, stricter ethical guidelines for court-appointed officials.
So everyone's held accountable for their actions.
Exactly. And we need a better system for reporting misconduct, one that's accessible, easy to understand.
So people aren't afraid to come forward.
Right. Because right now, it can feel like the system protects itself. And that needs to change.
It's a tall order. But what about the people who are going through it right now? What advice would you give to someone who feels stuck, maybe even hopeless?
Don't give up. You have a voice. Use it. Educate yourself. Document everything.
Dates, times, conversations, all of it.
Everything. And don't be afraid to reach out for help.
There are resources out there, support groups, legal aid organizations.
You're not alone in this. Remember that.
This deep dive has been a tough one. We've seen firsthand how a system that's supposed to protect families can sometimes do the opposite.
It's a reminder that we can't take justice for granted. We have to demand it, fight for it.
Because behind every legal document, every court filing, there are real people with real lives, and their stories deserve to be heard.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.